'cause in the end, for you and me, radioactivity.
Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is radiation carcinogenesis, but we are not going to talk about oncogenes and the molecular biology of it. We will cover that in a later lecture. Today we will start with looking at radiation carcinogenesis and the risk issues that are associated with it. And I promise you, much of this material will be on your boards. It's considered to be a very important area. Now, we have talked about this already in here, but I want to cover it again, and I will probably cover yet again because it is so important. We divide radiation effects into stochastic effects and deterministic effects. Stochastic effects are those effects that are single cell events. They begin in single cells. Induction of mutations is an example. Development of cancer is an example. These are, when we deal with radiation protection, we are most often protecting against stochastic effects, and most often we mean cancer when we talk about it. Regulatory agencies assume that any dose comes with some risks, and so therefore no dose is too small to be effective in cancer induction, and so that is a mechanism that we use for stochastic effects. We measure stochastic effects in sieverts, not in gray, but in sieverts. So when you are getting your film badge back and what it reads, they are giving it to you in sieverts because they are looking at your cancer risk associated with your exposure. This is in contrast to deterministic effects. They were used to be called non-stochastic. They're now called in Europe tissue effects, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see this movement in the US. I'm a member of the National Council on Radiation Protection, and in one of the most recent documents, they started to talk about tissue effects instead of deterministic effects. These are responses that have a dose threshold. And they are normally involved with some sort of killing effect. So when we think about normal tissue toxicities, or we look at those acute radiation toxicities that we talked about last time, they have a threshold, and below that we don't see very much, and above that we do. Why is that? Why is there that difference? It's because with radiation, you need to kill so many cells before you see the tissue effect or the deterministic effect take place. So, there's no very little gut toxicity until you reach a given threshold for the gut, and then we will see the beginning of the GI syndrome. This distinction is really important, and it will be asked on your boards in a variety of different ways. Here are the curves for these, and you need to know these as well. So this is a plot of the percentage of people that are affected against radiation dose. And here for the stochastic effects, what are we looking at? We're looking at the induction of cancer, leukemia, maybe mutations as well. And of course, mutations relate to cancer, at least in somatic cells. This model that we accept here is called the linear non-threshold model. We'll talk about that model in a few moments. There's also the linear quadratic non-threshold, which comes up like this, and that's usually the model that's used to explain leukemia. So if you are asked on your boards, what's the best model to explain cancer induction, you would say the linear non-threshold model. On the other hand, there is the curve that we have for deterministic effects or tissue effects. And this is called a threshold sigmoidal curve because it's got a threshold below which nobody is affected, above which people become affected. And the change from only a few people affected to many people affected can be very steep, or it can be very shallow, and it depends on the kind of response that we're looking at. And we'll look at some of these threshold sigmoidal curves later. I will mention that apparently this curve set was on the boards, and they asked you to label which responses went with which ones. They put, I think cataracts was one, and that of course fits a deterministic model. Leukemia was one, and that fits linear quadratic non-threshold model, et cetera, et cetera. So you do need to understand these curves and their relevance to the induction. This is one other point to be made again, is that this threshold really means that we're getting sufficient cell killing to be able to see an effect, whereas for carcinogenesis, this stochastic model, it's mostly about mutations. And Hall makes this point about deletions, but deletions are actually a type of mutation. Okay, so how do we understand what we do about cancer effects and radiation carcinogenesis? We do based on studying populations. And we will be looking at studies that have been done in different populations, a lot particularly in occupational groups, some in cancer patients, and some in high-risk individuals. Playing into this, of course, are all the different types of epidemiology, including environmental epidemiology, genetic and molecular epidemiology, clinical epidemiology. All these come together to look at how these influence of population studies. So here's a listing of major human population exposures and what cancers have been associated with them. And I believe you need to know this list. There are a number of boards questions I've seen that ask for matching between cancer. Which of the following matches between cancer and treatment is correct? So Japanese atomic bomb survivors, will spend quite a bit of time on this population. It is the most important population for determining our risk estimates. About 120,000 people have been followed long-term. There's a registry of exposures. This population is very compliant. They come in for all of their testing, and so it becomes easy to follow their effects. They were exposed to neutrons and gamma rays. Very precise dosimetry was done. Most of their exposure is actually gamma rays, not neutrons. As I said, we'll look at those in a few minutes. There is a population with ankylosing spondylitis, which is a severe arthritis of the spine, affects men more than women. And what they did, and actually still do for some of these patients, is they would give them an X-ray dose to the spine. Why are they giving the X-ray dose to the spine? They're doing it to decrease inflammation. Now, I want to bring this up in light of the COVID discussion that's been going on lately. I was involved in the big COVID workshop that NCI and NCRP sponsored a few weeks ago. In fact, the report's going to be coming out very soon. And it was this concept that radiation inhibits inflammation when given at low doses, but induces inflammation at higher doses, that led to the idea of treating patients with COVID, with very severe COVID pneumonia, with low-dose radiation exposure. The idea was you give them low-dose radiation, you turn off the inflammatory response, and they will get better. And the studies were very limited. I believe that the report out of Emory was like 6 or 7 patients, and they had pretty good results with those. And so there are a few more clinical trials that are ongoing now, although that workshop was very questionable about whether there was value in using radiation or not, and would not take a stand on it. But it came from these early studies with ankylosing spondylitis patients where they would give them a low-dose X-ray to the spine. The problem was there was a lot of marrow in the field, and they developed a higher incidence of leukemia. They would also give them radium salt injections. Radium goes homes to bone, so it would go right to the bone, would decrease inflammatory responses, but it did lead to an increased incidence of bone tumors. These therapies are still used because the cancer risk is relatively low compared to the efficacy of the treatment. In UK in particular, but in a few other places, there were children that came in with enlarged thymuses. The idea was if you had a large thymus, you might go on to develop severe allergies. So they gave these kids a dose to the thymus to shrink the thymus. It led to what's in the field when you give that dose. the thyroid is, and it led to an increased incidence of thyroid cancers. We no longer do this. It's no longer considered to be a risk for asthma or allergies just to have a large thymus. In 1940s, we did not do surgery for removal of adenoids and tonsils. When adenoids and tonsils were inflamed, what we would do is give them a dose of radiation. This would cause them to decrease in size because they're lymphoid organs. They're extremely radiation sensitive. And what would happen, though, however, was if you think about what's in the field, thyroid was in the field, and these patients developed thyroid cancer. There is now, it's not yet in Hall's textbook, but I've seen a couple of reports that say that they also have a higher incidence of meningiomas. So that's another thing that's been coming out in the literature. Tinea capitis is a very nasty ringworm of the scalp. It is it disfigures people. It is very uncomfortable. It makes them itch and hurt at the same time. And so what was done for this ringworm was they used an X-ray dose to try to kill the ringworm itself. When they gave a dose to the scalp, what would happen is the thyroid was in the field, and so was the skin on the head. And so they had a higher incidence of developing thyroid cancer and skin cancers. They also developed meningiomas, brain tumors, leukemia, salivary glands. I should mention that this was like a worldwide thing. The immigrants from North Africa to Israel were among the earliest that were studied, and I have a friend in Israel who's doing some of these studies now. But this happened throughout all of Europe and in the U.S. In the U.S., the University of Rochester in New York has a repository of tissues from these patients, so you can go back and study them. The American experience was much more with thyroid and skin cancers. I just wonder if we didn't follow them out longer because it was the following up for a longer period of time that meningiomas and brain tumors popped up in these patients. So, you know, I just wonder whether the American experience would be different if we'd taken that to longer time points. In the early days of treating TB, they would use fluoroscopy. What happened with fluoroscopy is there'd be a pretty hefty dose to the chest, and women had an increased incidence of breast tumors that developed. There was a kind of cool contrast medium called thorotrast. As its name implies, it had thorium in it, which emits radioactive alpha particles. These would go, the thorotrast, when it was injected into people as a contrast medium, would go right to the liver. The radioactive alpha particles would sit in the liver and irradiate, and patients would have a higher incidence of liver tumors than controls. And in fact, it was actually a pretty hefty incidence. We no longer use thorotrast. We have much better contrast mechanisms now. Recently and still, for patients with severe peptic ulcer, we give a dose of radiation. What was found was if you give a dose lower than 10 gray, you have a higher risk of developing stomach cancer. So therefore, they've been giving a dose of 10 gray or higher. This was actually a board's question about 2 or 3 years ago. So I think this chart is something you need to know. Let me pull out a couple of other things that are important. This is now the Japanese atomic bomb survivors, 120,000 that are studied for lifespan. There's an in utero exposed cohort of 3,600. We'll talk about these later when we talk about mental retardation and microcephaly. And then there are the children of people that were exposed. This was 77,000, probably about 4 years ago or 5 years ago. It's gone up since then, of course. Here's the RERF facility. This is sitting, it's hard to tell in this image, but it's sitting on a hilltop looking over the city of Hiroshima. There is this structure here to mark the site where the bomb dropped off, or the hypocenter of the bomb is. And this is well, you know, it's become a peace city because of that. Here's the city of Nagasaki. Bomb was dropped about here. there's not the kind of memorials in Nagasaki as there are in Hiroshima. Most of the experimental studies were taken to Hiroshima, even from Nagasaki, although the university in Nagasaki did do multiple different studies. So those are the populations that were exposed. There are also occupational exposures that we'll mention, and these two will come up as board's questions. In irradiated populations, cancer is the most common late somatic effect. That is important to know. When people were the early people that discovered radiation, a lot of the radiation radiologists who put their hand in the beam got skin cancer. Dentists who put their hand in the beam. In the old days, when a dentist wanted to clip a film of your teeth, he or she would stick the film in and hold it with their fingers and then clip a photo. Well, now you bite down on it and the technician leaves the room. But things have changed, and it's because of the skin cancer that developed. For uranium and radium miners, they're often breathing in dust that contains alpha particles in it, so they have a much higher exposure to lung cancer. This is what led to people being concerned about radon in the home, was if the miners are getting lung cancer, what about people with radon in the home? And we'll talk about this population in a moment, particularly the significance that came about from smoking with alpha particle exposure. Bone tumors popped up in people that painted watch dials on watches. We'll look at this. I'll show you a picture of this population in a moment. And then radiologists before the 1920s and anybody who administered radiotherapy with radionuclides before the 1920s, risks were not understood. They had a much higher risk of developing leukemia. So if you'll remember from I think the first lecture, we had this image of the radiologist who's sticking his hand in the beam. The technician is trying to clip the photo of it. And this is to calibrate before the patient comes in. Well, doing this for every patient led to a higher incidence of skin cancer and leukemia in radiologists. We no longer do that. Safety practices have come in, and so nobody is standing there except the patient when the photo is being clipped. Here's an image of Marie Curie, her daughter Irene. I met Irene a few years ago. She since has passed away. There's a movie out on, I think, Amazon called Radioactivity, which is the story of Marie Curie's life. A little bit fictionalized, a little bit sensationalized, but a lot of accuracies there. She died of leukemia working with radium almost her entire life, not knowing the risks of cancer associated with radium work. These are ampules of radioactivity that contain, actually ampules that contain radium. This is a woman's breast cancer, and they would put these onto the patient's cancer in order to have treatment. And the physicians who did this had a lot of exposure because of that. They would even make up these ampules and have to be and go on to develop cancer, mostly leukemia and skin cancer. Here are these radium dial painters I mentioned. These were women normally in about like the 1920s. And what they would do, mostly women who took these jobs, they would paint watch dials on the watches. They would, in order to make them luminescent, they would be radioactive. And radium was an incredibly good compound for making them be radioactive. We quit using radium in our watches probably about 20 years ago, 30 years ago, switched to tritium for a while. They were not so intensely bright. And now, of course, we use watches that are backlit and don't have such a problem. But what these women would do is they would paint the watch dial on, and in the process they would lick the tip of the paintbrush to make it be finer and ingest a large amount of radium. Radium, as we have already heard, homes to bone, caused osteosarcomas in quite a few of these patients. We'll look at the data for this in a few moments. It's interesting that this is one of the few cancers that actually has a threshold that we can see in patients. I have a couple of skulls from women that developed osteosarcoma that were watch-style painters. Some of them have been sent out to PINA, now the repository for radioactive human tissues. Here's a hand of a dentist. Right here, you can see the skin cancer that developed. Eventually, this dentist had to have these fingers amputated because the skin cancer was so severe. Here is the karyotype from a lymphocyte of a radiologist who went on to develop leukemia as a result of it. What they found was that there was a much higher incidence of chromosome mutations in radiologists than there was in control groups, and that's no surprise considering their dose they were exposed to. And here we get to this issue of cigarette smoking and alpha particles. So minors were a population that were heavy smokers, and a lot of people argued that you can't look at their alpha particle exposure as being cancer inducing because it's probably the smoking. So there was a study done a number of years ago and looked at the workers that were non-smokers versus the workers that smoked and how much they smoked. And what it looks clear from here is that if you smoke and have a low exposure, you do of course have an increased risk for developing lung cancer. But if you put smoking on top of that, then you drastically increase your chances of developing lung cancer. So mining alone was a risk, smoking alone was a risk, but now throw in both together and now we have a significantly increased risk. So it's one of those issues where two factors combine together. There are also a lot of other issues that need to be considered for when we look at lung cancer risk. Asbestos exposure is often very common as well. It has always been extremely difficult to estimate dose, so dose response curves are really hard to be able to discern. And as I had said earlier, this led to the worry about radon in the homes, but to tell you the truth, that story has really never been resolved. What was found in a lot of studies was that if you live in high radon areas, you have a lower risk, and don't smoke, you have a lower risk of developing lung cancer than if you live in low radon areas, which makes no sense, but it suggests that something other than radon is a driver for lung cancer. For leukemia, please remember for your boards, CLL is not induced by radiation. It's not affected by radiation. CLL is the one non-radiation induced cancer. AML and CML are both induced. They're induced mostly in adults that are radiated, not so frequently in children. Skin cancer, as we said, dentists, x-ray technicians, radiologists in the early days all developed skin cancer, but this has gone down with modern safety approaches. So what we do is we tend to look at organs and ask the question, are they highly radiogenic or not? We already know that we can't say this cancer came from radiation because of its mutation. As I had said very early in this class, the mutations for radiation are not a whole lot different than the mutations one finds for carcinogens. So to try to discern whether radiation comes from, whether a cancer comes from radiation or not is hard to know. So what the U.S. government approach has been is if you live in an area that was exposed to atomic bomb testing, such as Utah and Nevada, then they just automatically pay reparations to those states by reducing their tax burden as compensation for the cancer that we believe that we've caused in that population. A second way in which people often look at this is whether a cancer is radiogenic. So a military person goes to the VA board and wants to be reimbursed for cancer from radiation exposure, and the person has pancreatic cancer. Well, we don't have a lot of evidence that pancreas is a type of cancer that is induced by radiation. So this is not going to go through. I already said CLL, not induced by radiation. actually this should say CML, not CLL, as we have, yes, here's CLL, that's correct. So then the issue becomes what goes on for the other cancers. We have radiogenic areas of the body, and of these, bone marrow, breast, salivary glands, and thyroid are probably the most common, and those are the ones that are pretty easily radiation induced. So the veteran who comes in and says, whoa, I have a thyroid cancer, I was working out at the Nevada test site. Well, there was a lot of iodine produced, radioactive iodine goes to thyroid. It's quite possible. They might win their case and get funds paid for their exposure. Bladder, colon, stomach, liver, lung, ovary, and skin are moderate. Bone, brain, connective tissue, kidney, larynx, and nasal sinuses are pretty low in their radiogenic. It's not to say it never happens, but it's not so likely. And then we have the ones where it's virtually low or absent, which is this long list of tumors. So now let's put the picture together from a risk issue analysis. First of all, there was a latent period, just as there was for the early tissue toxicities that we talked about last time. There's a latent period here, which is defined as the time between the person's being exposed to radiation and the time it took to develop the cancer. For thyroid cancers, please remember this. This is a board's question. We had a different understanding of thyroid cancers before. They behave differently than other solid tumors. From Chernobyl, we learned that they start to come up pretty quickly. But around 4 years after, we start to see a pretty higher incidence. It peaks around 7 to 8 years and continues to be high throughout life compared to unexposed populations. Leukemia, generally the incidence in most textbooks, they claim it begins at 3 years after exposure, but I'm telling you the data I've seen, you start to see an increase at 1 year after exposure. And certainly in radiation oncology patients, we see it 1 year after exposure. The peak is usually 7 to 12 years after exposure, but it's gone by 20 years. So for instance, the Hiroshima Nagasaki population, 20 years after the atomic bomb blast was dropped, we did not see any more incidences of leukemia that came about because of that. Other solid tumors, not thyroid cancer, looks like the risk begins at 20 years out and continues to be at a higher risk throughout life. But the fact of the matter is that I believe these data are changing. We'll look at some data that say that it's 12 years after exposure for breast cancer, and it may even be sooner. I don't know how to, computer's doing weird stuff. Okay. The latent period is going to be affected by how old the person is at exposure. We'll look at those data. It's going to be affected actually by sex of the person, and it's also going to be affected by the age that the tumor would usually be expressed. So, you're not going to see a breast tumor pop up in a 12-year-old girl. You're going to see it after hormones have been turned on and are present later in life. The solid tumors from Japanese atomic bomb survivors in order of frequency, and this is a board's question. Bladder was most common, followed by breast, lung, thyroid, colon, stomach, and liver. And that's part of how these get their markings. Breast and thyroid are considered to be highly radiogenic. Bladder, lung, colon, stomach, and liver are moderately radiogenic. Probably the lung incidence is affected by the high smoking rates that happened in the Japanese atomic bomb survivors at that time. And there's some evidence that the bladder cancer high incidence may have been associated with some chemicals in the area. So there's a lot of work being done on risk assessment. You will see tons of papers on it right now. It's being done in multiple different populations. The problems with risk assessment are that you normally have to look at what happens at high doses and extrapolate down at low doses. No large population has been studied for their lifespan. I mean, the largest is the Japanese atomic bomb survivors, and we still have more to go before we're done with that lifespan. But it still is a population of only 120,000 people. I mean, this seems very large, but if you think about the human-to-human variations in so many different things, like diet and where we live and how we live, it makes for a very big difference, and it makes it harder to draw big conclusions. And then, most of the studies are based on Japan from the 1940s. I mean, I'm not sure that applies to Japan today, certainly not to American populations today. In any case, people developed two immediate models, and then they've come up with a third model more recently. The first two models, the first was to look at absolute risk, which is that based on the concept that radiation induces a batch of cancers that are above the natural background and unrelated to it. The second idea was called relative risk, which says that radiation increases and enhances the natural background incidence at all ages. The more recent view has been that excess radiation, excess cancer risk of radiation exposure is a function of a bunch of parameters: dose squared, age of exposure, the time since they were exposed, the sex of the person, and all of these, I believe, are going to play a critical role. So this third model is probably much more reasonable. It's what's used more frequently today, and we'll look at least some of these parameters and how they influence us. Now, if we look at thyroid cancers first, we got some data from Japanese atomic bomb survivors. I'll show you that. But Chernobyl probably provided us with the largest number and changed very much what we thought about thyroid cancer incidence. This was an I-131 induced cancer. The most common examples were that children drank milk that had I-131 in it. All of this could have been prevented if they'd been given potassium iodide, or just don't drink milk for the next few days. But potassium iodide, as we learned last time, is a blocker, and it would have blocked the accumulation of I-131 in the thyroid. There was an increased incidence first reported in children. It began at 4 years after exposure, and it hasn't really gone back down to background yet. So the idea is that the risk may remain high for life. It's not as high as it was at, say, 10 years or 7 years, but it is still there. But it's interesting that at least of the initial exposed cases during that first 4 to 7 years, there were about 4,000 cases. There were a little over 10 deaths, and people vary on exactly how many, whether it was 11 or 12. But the fact is that the reason why there were so few deaths is because they went in, they treated these patients with radioactive iodine. So they gave them more of this. The radioactive iodine ablated the thyroid, and so then they no longer had cancer. The mutations are important. This has been a board's question. And there's a controversy in the literature about whether thyroid carcinomas from Chernobyl are different from other thyroid carcinomas that pop up in the regular population. What they found was that there were a lot of rearrangements in the RET-PTC genes. There were point mutations in KRAS and also point mutations in BRAF. And these seem to be very common for the Chernobyl population and were related possibly to a unique, to something that might be unique. That's been controversial. The Ukrainians and Russians still believe that they have a unique signature mutation. A lot of others don't. There is also a lot of controversy on the actual incidence of the tumors, because that area of Ukraine where Chernobyl was had a very high incidence of thyroid disease already. They had a high incidence of goiter. The population was poorly studied. So there are a lot of people that just say, look, you guys, there's not a big increase here. It's just that we're going and clinically looking at these patients, which we haven't done before. Fukushima, they went in and looked at the thyroid cancers, and they did see an increase, and it was totally because of a sampling error, because they hadn't checked this population that much before. So there was no real increase in thyroid cancer with Fukushima. With Chernobyl, I believe the data are pretty firm that there's been an increase, and on your boards, I would say there's been an increase. The primary tumors were papillary thyroid tumors. And while there was not a change in number of tumors that one had, they did find that the shorter the time from exposure to the induction of the tumor, they had a more aggressive tumor. And I think it's because they were allowed to progress for a longer period of time. It increased metastases and everything else. Here are the data on thyroid cancer from external exposure, not from internal exposure from the iodine, but this is from external exposure. Here are the people that are over 15. Here are the population that are under 15. You can see that these are a little bit different than internal exposures, and that will be something that I think is a common theme, but it won't come out on your boards at all. But I'm pretty sure that the mechanisms of an internal exposure where you're getting continual exposure for a long period of time are going to be very different than the exposure from external, which is for a short time and then it's gone. So the story for Chernobyl and indeed for radioactive fallout in the US, where probably a large number of our thyroid cancers in, say, the 1960s were popping up, was there was iodine that was released, it fell in the grass, the cows ate it, it went in the milk, kids drank it, and it went to the thyroid. Here's just a diagram of this thyroid papillary carcinoma that was induced by radioactive iodine from a Chernobyl experience. And so we come now to this question of the dose response issues and the controversy that exists in the field. So most of the population studies that have been done, the atomic bomb survivors in particular, have suggested that there's a dose response at low doses, but not necessarily at high doses. So here's the example that they're talking about. Here is a myeloid leukemia in the male mouse, and at low doses you see this dose response, but at high doses you don't. Why would this happen? Well, Hall speculates that at these higher doses we're getting a lot of cell killing, and so therefore we don't see as many leukemias, and most people accept that this model for the high doses is true. But at the lower doses, this is where the biggest controversy exists, because there are some groups that accept the linear non-threshold model and some that don't. So here's the reason why the model is so controversial. And this diagram is sort of backwards. This should actually have dose at this end and adverse health effects, but it's the same idea. So what the situation is that we have a lot of data from the Hiroshima population here at the high doses. We have an error bar that goes here that's very large for the low doses because we have so little data here. This is about where our natural background would occur. This is where the Environmental Protection Agency sets our threshold for environmental exposures. We have a radiation facility out west that gives us very low exposures if we want to look at low dose radiation effects. But it's this, where does this error bar fit? What does it really look like? And so people have come up with these couple of models. Here's the linear non-threshold model that people have used for many years. And it says that as you increase the dose, you increase the radiation exposure. I'm sorry, I'm going to put on headphones. I hope you can hear me better. There's somebody's drilling in the background. So here's the and if you can't hear me, please interrupt me. Here's the relative risk for cancer and the radiation dose. This is now radiation linear with a threshold, which says that there's no real incidence below a particular threshold, but after that it goes up in a linear fashion. Now, there are many groups that support this model, including Canada and France. And what they're trying to do is say that, well, CT is safe, so therefore under a CT there's no real increase in cancer incidence, and above that there is. And the mechanism they claim is there's so much repair at low doses that it's not really an issue anyway. Then there's the linear quadratic model, which is shown here, which is similar to what we think happens for leukemias. Then there's the hormesis model, which says, whoa, a little bit of radiation is good for you. Go sit in a radioactive spa. lap up those rays because it will stimulate your immune system. And to tell you the truth, there are data that support that. But if you stimulate your immune system and you still get cancer, how do you plot that in terms of risk? And also Hall has this model. Now, I need to mention that's not included in this is there are some people that actually say that a little bit of radiation is worse for you than a high dose. There are several groups that have posited that model as well. And so then what a lot of people claim is if you have all these models and you don't actually know what's going on, which we don't have the data down here. If you don't know what's going on, then isn't the safest thing to say, here we've got linear non-threshold, and therefore we'll keep everybody safer. And this makes a lot of sense. Where it becomes problematic is where we're cleaning up radioactive waste sites, say, down south or out west, and we have to clean them up to a linear non-threshold model that leads us to have problems. And maybe we're spending trillions cleaning up the waste site, whereas if we had to only clean it up, say, to this level, we might be only spending billions. Okay, and this says the same thing. Okay, so what did the data say? Here we go. Not really that low a dose. This is maybe 50 to 20 centigrade, so it's not really that low. This shows an increased incidence of thyroid cancer following radiation exposure. But look at these error bars, pretty large, hard to draw the conclusion that there's an increased risk here at the low doses. Here are data on breast cancer from 2 populations of fluoroscopy patients, the Japanese atomic bomb survivors and mastitis patients who were treated because of inflammatory disease in the breast, again, giving relatively low dose exposure to try to decrease inflammation. Most of them show this dose response curve goes down and back up. But at low doses, not really seeing an increase over what we see as predicted, except perhaps in this Japanese atomic bomb survivor population, which I'm not sure. My dealings with people from RERF suggest that they don't think this is really a significant increase. Here are the data on the radium diode painters. I told you already, this is the population that's showing a threshold. So they're looking at the incidence of osteosarcomas in this population. Goes with nothing for a while, and then it has an increase. And this looks much more like a threshold sigmoidal curve than it does like a linear non-threshold curve. Why this should be the case, I don't know, but I do wonder again whether this is the difference from an external exposure versus from an internal exposure, which is what the radium would do, versus external beam. Now, one other thing that's been coming up lately that has been done in the lifespan study from the Japanese atomic bomb survivors, as I said to you, leukemia was only studied for about the first 20 years because it decreased and never came back up. Solid cancers have continued to go up in this population, and it actually still goes up and allows for further study. But what else people started to study were particularly cardiovascular effects and other non-cancer effects. And you can see this increase. It's very slight. Not really that easily detectable, but it's leading to the suggestion that radiation can cause cardiovascular disease. Certainly, we know for high dose radiation, if for breast cancer, if the heart's in the field, there's a higher incidence of cardiovascular disease. Lung cancer, a lot of people are looking at that now, but it looks like that's the case. So we know that at high doses, there is an association. Is it true at lower doses? Latest data from Japanese atomic bomb survivors suggest it is. On your boards, I would answer that question, yes. But it's leading to a lot of studies about like mechanisms and everything else. So here are the solid cancer examples that came from the Japanese atomic bomb survivors. Here are the male versus female percentages. We'll talk about this in a moment. I don't think you need to know these numbers, but I'm going to point out a couple of things when we look here at the excess relative risk. So here is the excess risk for solid tumors in the atomic bomb survivors. Here's the excess risk for leukemia. Now, I want you to notice that this y-axis is different values for these two. So there's a boards question that asks, which is higher incidence, leukemias versus solid tumors? And the answer is for all solid tumors, the incidence is higher. But then there's another boards question that asks about leukemias against specific solid tumors, and leukemias are higher than any specific solid tumor. So be very careful how that question is worded for how you deal with it. And this just shows the effect of dose versus leukemia. It does show a dose response curve that's pretty significant, and it tracks well. And they were looking at all leukemias except CLL, and as I said, CLL is not radiation induced. And then they looked at organ-specific cancer risk. I had already mentioned this order to you, but let me show it to you again. The risk for bladder is greater than breast, then lung, then thyroid, then colon, and then everything else, stomach, then liver. I would know this order because this is has been asked on the board's question. So here we come to two major points that I'm going to make right now that are definitely important for your boards. Point number one, is there a difference for age the person is at the time of exposure? What this chart says is that if you're young, you have a higher risk for developing cancer if you're exposed when you're young versus when you're old. Why would that be? Well, if we look at like the age at which these tumors pop up, for a lot of solid tumors, they don't pop up until 20, 30, 40 years after exposure. If you are out here at age 60 or 70, your chances of living 20, 30, 40 years after exposure are not so great. So your risk goes down just because of your life expectancy. Whereas if you're 2 or 3 years old, your chances of living 20 years to 22 or 32 or 42, they're drastically increased. So just because your life expectancy is greater, you have a higher risk for developing a cancer. So that's one mechanism. There are some people that also say that the young cells may be more radiosensitive and more likely to become tumor cells. That's much less well understood, not accepted, but it is this difference in life expectancy that makes for that major difference. The second thing to note from this chart is that females have a higher risk for developing cancer than males. In part, this is because of breast cancer, but it looks like even for like lung cancer, females have a higher risk. We're going to learn later that males have a higher risk if exposed for passing mutations onto their offspring than females, but females have a higher risk for developing cancer. NASA has been freaked out about this difference because there they are thinking about sending up female astronauts, and the risk calculations are different for females. And so going from here to Mars for 3 years or 4 years, it changes the picture significantly. And this is a mistake in Hall's textbook. Mistakes in Hall's textbook often find their way to being on the boards. These are reversed. This is actually the males. This is actually the females. So these are very different. So they're just reversed. There's an error. Okay. So now I want to move for a moment from, so think about Japanese atomic bomb survivors. What did they get? They got all their exposure within a very short time. The bomb blast happened within, the flash of that blast is when they got the majority of their exposure. And while some of the radiation stuck around for a while, it decreased very, very rapidly. So it was about an acute exposure. And that's what we give our patients, our acute exposures in general. We might give them a series of acute exposures, but that's what we give them, unless, of course, they're getting brachytherapy. But the majority of our environmental and occupational exposures are low dose rate. So they happen over our lifetime, perhaps, or over a matter of several days, or during our work week, if it's an occupational exposure. And the problem is, how do we extrapolate from the high dose rate where we have the data to the low dose rate where we don't have that much data. I'll tell you that there are some studies that are coming out on low dose rate in humans right now. I'm on the international commission that's trying to examine the effects of low dose rate. I'll do my best to tell you what's on your boards and to not complicate it with too many facts and stories. But right now, we don't have a good estimate of it. And so what we've done is we've said, and I'll show you later the animal data that we used, but we said, here's the high dose rate. Most of the animal data say that a low dose rate causes about half the mutations as a high dose rate. And what did we learn when we studied cellular studies? We said low dose rate is better than high dose rate for mutation induction, right? So because low dose rate is about half as good, we're going to decrease the risk by half. We're going to assume that the risk of cancer induction is half of what at low dose rates is about half of what it is at high dose rates, just because of what we know about mutation induction. We have committees that are working now looking at what human exposures look like. I think that model isn't so inaccurate, and it might not change, but it is complicated by the fact that many groups put together low dose and low dose rate. And they say, at low doses, we don't know what's going on. Here are the data that Hall uses saying that, whoa, a little bit of cancer, a little bit of radiation is really bad for you. They claim it's even worse than the linear non-threshold model. Many other people claim, but I think if you look at these data, you can't draw that conclusion very well. I would never draw that line that way. Okay, why are we not? There we go. There are other data being done by groups in Europe that said, here's what the linear non-threshold would look like. Above the line, there are a lot of risks at low doses. Below the line, there are very few. And this led for people to feel that there's a higher risk at low doses. And then we look at what happens in patients that develop secondary tumors following radiotherapy. Now, a lot of data argue that there's no increase if the dose is very high. 40 to 60 gray, particularly if the area is very limited, normally you won't see it. And what did we just say about those peptic ulcer patients earlier on in this lecture? We said patients that get irradiated for peptic ulcer, if the dose is greater than 10 gray, often don't go on to develop a secondary cancer. If it's less than 10 gray, they do. I would argue, though, that there's a penumbra around that has a lower dose, and that's what we need to worry about. This is the claim that if it's very limited, if it's very pinpointed, then the area around it is low enough to not have an increased risk. There are some groups that claim that secondary risk is going to be affected by genetics and lifestyle, and we know that I think that that's true, particularly for genetics, or smoking will increase the risk. We certainly know that radiotherapy incidence increases in the field for people that have been exposed to radiation. It is not as transforming, it's not as cancer inducing as chemo. We'll look at an example of that in a moment, kind of a classic example. If the chemo, but not all chemos are carcinogenic either. The example that is, of course, the classic that everybody talks about and has been on the boards for a number of years is give the patient Hodgkin's disease. They have an increased incidence of cancer, breast cancer years later in women. Give a patient retinoblastoma. They're often, the skull is in the field, of course, and they go on to develop osteosarcomas in the field. So we do know that that's the case. I keep saying CLL is not induced by radiation because it's important to know that for the boards. And so we have some evidence from this. I'll mention a little bit more, but let me just say that at very low doses, there is the question of what's really going on, whether there's an increased incidence, and some do report this sort of beneficial effect. So a few years ago, about 3 years ago, I was visiting this, I actually went to a radiation conference, and they took us to this spa called Niška Banja in Serbia. And Here is the Hotel Radon, where people come to get to lap up the rays and get better health and recover from their illnesses. Um, Basking in the radioactive waters there in hopes that they're going to be getting beneficial health effects. This has been done for centuries. And we do know that radiation causes an increase in radiation responses, immune responses, and therefore could be a good thing. I would argue, though, that probably effects on this, on elderly are not going to be so great as the effects on these children that are also playing in these radioactive waters. And that, I think, is something that should be, we need to think about. If we think about the radiation-induced tumors that pop up, there have been quite a few studies that have been done in recent years. They looked at, there were a couple of studies that looked at childhood tumors, looking at the primaries that were neuroblastomas, Hodgkin's disease, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, Wilms tumor, bone tumors, all of these being kind of classic childhood tumors. They received radiotherapy. They compared these that received radiotherapy, looking for the secondary tumors that popped up in the field, and finding breast, thyroid, some CNS tumors, some soft tissue sarcomas, and more recently also skin tumors. And notice, breast and thyroid are considered highly radiogenic. CNS is not, but that might be more radiogenic than we suspect. These data show that the risk begins at about 20 years and seems to have a continuous increase, never returning to background. Before this study was done, we believed that it started to come down at 40 or 50 years. After exposure, we no longer believe that it really comes down to background. So here's kind of the classic study that was done a number of years ago, where they looked at the relative risk of developing a secondary cancer against the kind of therapy that was used, and this is in time after treatment. And what they showed in the study was that if you were exposed to alkylating agents or topoisomerase inhibitors, you developed a secondary cancer with a higher incidence than if you got treated with just radiation. So here's the risk of secondary cancer for the chemos. Here it is for radiation. And you also lived longer cancer-free with radiation than you did with any of the chemo drugs. But look at these data, you start to see this popping up at around 12, 13 years. So I think that the incidence may go up not at 20 years, but starting around 12 or 13 years that we start to see secondary cancer go up. There have been a number of studies in Hall's textbook looking at changes in risk for developing cancers following prostate treatment, radiotherapy for the prostate, but they included some out of the field sarcomas. Some of the dosing here is like almost negligible. These data were very questionable when they came out, and a lot of people are not convinced by the statistics either. And here, where they looked in the near treatment field, I don't know, just as much risk of no cancer as there is of developing a cancer. These were not really statistically significant. So most of the people I talked to are not convinced that there is a risk of developing a lot of secondary cancers following prostate treatment. For breast cancers, here are the atomic bomb survivors. Here are the Hodgkin's data. This looks real. These are really radiation-induced cancers, and there is a higher risk following exposure, and it looks to be somewhat dose responsive. Meningiomas seem to also go up in children, probably more than gliomas, and we find this to be very common. These are data from the UK. I don't think we need to go through all those. These are excess cancer risks for leukemias versus solid cancers. These are mortality risks. These are British radiologists that were studied. Again, I don't think you need to know all these details. Risks from different cohorts, secondary cancer after radiotherapy. These data are useful to look at. I haven't seen them come up on the boards. There is a question I've seen that asks about increased risk for nuclear power workers and also for health workers in the that work with radiation. The answers to those issues have been that really there's not much of an increase for nuclear industry workers. We'll look at some data on people that work in the health industry, but that doesn't look to be so big either. And this one big increase in leukemia in the UK was actually due to a chemical problem, not due to a radiation problem. So, so there were many issues going on there. Nuclear power is going up. We're going to see more issues coming up with it. Here are solid tumors and leukemias for atomic bomb survivors. I don't think you need to know all these numbers. This is lifetime risk that has been looked at, but here's the summary of cancer risks. So I just want to emphasize a couple of very important points that I've tried to emphasize, and then we'll hit a couple of other things that are very critical, I think, for the boards. So first of all, radiation exposure usually causes an increased risk of particular cancers throughout life. The risk can decrease with time after exposure, but in most situations, aside from, say, leukemia, it never reaches no risk. The risks do vary with age, and if you're exposed at a young age, you have an increased risk than if you're exposed when you're older, mostly because your life expectancy is greater. There is a variation in risk associated with different cancer sites. So some sites are more cancer-inducing, more radiogenic than others. The female is more likely to develop cancer than the male, and originally breast cancer is certainly a big component of that, but it looks like lung cancer is also very, very important in the most recent data. As you decrease the dose rate, you also decrease the risk. There are a lot of agencies that set up guidelines. I work with a number of these. I'm on the UN committee that sets radiation risk limits. We're meeting actually in a couple of weeks. There's the BEER committee, biological effects of ionizing radiations. I've worked with them. I'm a member of the ICRP and the NCRP. I work a lot with the NRC, not so much with these other groups, although a little bit with Homeland Security. But I just need to tell you this on your boards. There are a lot of boards questions that say, in NCRP report number 829, it says blah, 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 blah. And you have to answer, is that one of the true statements or is that one of the false statements? Never, never ignore the thing about NCRP report number, whatever. Ignore that part of the question and only ask the question, is the rest of the statement correct? Because they're never going to test you on whether a particular report says something, but they are going to test you on whether you know the principle that the report stated. So ignore that part of the question and only look at the part of the question that says, there's an increased risk with young age exposure or whatever. Just so you've thought about that and are aware of it. Okay. I will tell you that while I'm going to say this, I don't know that this is going to be on the boards, but I wouldn't be surprised if it does come up in the next couple of years. We do not have, as I keep telling you, a lot of good data for low dose rate exposures. So I had mentioned this when we talked about the acute radiation toxicities. There is a weapons complex in the Ural Mountains in Russia, actually borders on Siberia, actually. I've been there a number of times. It's called Mayak. And we mentioned that there were some major exposures there where they dumped radiation into the Tetra River. It was very high level. They didn't tell the population. The population was washing their laundry, drinking their water, doing everything with the Tetra River, and was exposed. There was also an explosion in 1957 of a nuclear waste storage tank that dumped a lot of radiation in the area. They evacuated the zone, but they really couldn't clean up the strontium and the plutonium. There's also another accident where the water was dumped, radiation was dumped down a drain where a ton of waste came in. They diverted it into from Lake Karache, which is extremely radioactive today. Diverted it into a river system. When this lake dried up, it blew radiation all over the area. So this population, though, that's living in this area, sad as it is exposed to low dose rate radiation. They're exposed a little bit each day, each day, each day. And so there are a lot of ongoing studies to try to understand low dose rate effects. As these data from the MIAC population come out, I think we're going to understand more about low dose rate exposures. There's also some work that's been done with atomic test sites. So probably, you know, with the 75th anniversary of the bomb, you've been hearing Nevada test site data. I've actually gotten a lot of letters from people in Nevada and Utah about the exposures. The Marshall Islands are major exposures. The world was doing major weapons testing at different points. We know that the test site in Nevada drove a lot of radiation into Utah. Utah's getting reparations for it. They have actually a lower cancer incidence than any other state in the union, probably because of lifestyle issues there. But there have been across the whole U.S. Thyroid cancers and stuff that probably are attributable to the fallout that came from those sites. We can actually look at cesium deposition, probably also from radioactive fallout, and see it across the U.S. Here's just the power of what one of these bombs looks like. This was one that they dropped at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. This was actually now a hydrogen bomb, not an atomic bomb. It was detonated, was meant to blow up this fleet of old ships. They were looking to see the effects. Whoever took this picture was probably exposed pretty heftily to it. And because of the doses that came, this population has been studied for both high dose and low dose rate exposures. We have been paying reparations to Marshall Islands for many years. And there's one board's question that it's like a true or false about testing in the Pacific on as a result of nuclear testing and increased cancer incidence in the Marshall Islands. And the answer is yes. The increased cancer incidence is definitely can be attributed to the atomic bomb. I don't think I need to talk about all the data from thyroid. I think I've sort of mentioned this already. I don't think we need to look at doses. Here are data on exposures. But here we come to a very critical, I promise you this will be on the board's question, that in a way I'm not sure I agree with it or believe in it, but you got to know it. So let me do my best to explain this. And if it doesn't make sense, please let me know if I'm happy to explain it again. Okay, so the International Commission on Radiation Protection, a long time ago in 1990, came up with this association of dose rate with a cancer risk. And what they did is something that I don't believe is accurate, and I don't think ICRP believes is accurate anymore. They said they put together high dose and high dose rate and low dose and low dose rate. And I am not sure that low dose and low dose rate you can put together so well. And they drew their cutoff point only based on dose, not based on dose rate. So a low dose rate exposure is less than or equal to 0.2 sievert. A high dose rate exposure is anything over 0.2 sievert. And then what they said is, we're going to divide risk into working populations and whole populations. Why are we dividing it that way? Because a working population is exposed to their working place only 8 hours a day. The exposure to the whole population, they're exposed to all the time. And so therefore, these come with different risks. The risk for a whole population exposure is greater than the risk for a working population. And then they said, as we said before, the low dose rate is going to be half of the risk for the high dose rate. Okay, so what do these numbers mean? This is saying that the risk of getting a fatal, lethal cancer from radiation exposure is 8% per sievert of exposure. The risk in a working population. In a whole population, for a high dose rate, that is anything over 0.2 sievert, is 10% per sievert. What's the risk for an exposure that's 0.2 sieverts or less? It's 4% per sievert for the working population, 5% per sievert for the whole population. Okay, are they going to ask you these numbers precisely on the boards? I don't think so. What they're going to ask you is, you have the city of Minneapolis, St. Paul with a, actually they won't even say the name of the city anymore because they said that that's too emotional. So they're going to say, you have a city of 1 million people that's been exposed to 0.2 sieverts of radiation. What number of excess cancers do you expect? Okay, so is that a working or a whole population? It's a whole population, it's the whole city. It's 0.2 sieverts, so it's less than or equal to 0.2 sieverts. So therefore, it's a low dose exposure. So you use the 5% per sievert number. It was a 0.2 sievert exposure. So this is 5% per sievert, but it was only 0.2 sievert exposure. So it's going to be 5% divided by the 0.2. So it's going to be 0.1% of the 1 million people. And please remember, you have to convert from the number of sievert you have to per sievert. That's really critical. I know 2 people 2 years ago that missed that question just because they forgot to convert, and they will hope you forget to convert. Another exposure, there is a nuclear power plant that has a massive explosion, has employees, 4,000 employees that were exposed to 2 sieverts of radiation. Okay. Working population, right? Power plant. 2 sieverts is definitely high dose rate. It's 8% per sievert, but this was 2 sieverts. So it's going to be 16% of the 4,000 workers are going to get a lethal cancer. That's how they're going to ask these. They may actually even give the exposure in gray and expect you to convert to sievert. They shouldn't, but they might. Please be prepared for this. I will tell you honestly that I do not believe these numbers are accurate. I don't think this is a good way to determine cancer risk or the number of people that are going to die from cancer, but the boards still ask it, even though ICRP actually has a different approach now. Okay, astronauts have a risk. We're not going to talk about that. We're going to skip that part because I don't think it's relevant for this population, for this group. So there are these human populations that have been used to estimate cancer risk from radiation exposure. They are dependent on the age the person is at the time of the exposure. They are dependent on dose and dose rate. They are actually dependent on sex. The radiation has been associated with development of secondary malignancies in the field. And there are these national and international agencies whose job it is to assess the risk and to help us assess what those risks are likely to be and how to control for them. Okay. Well, let's see if I can find the next topic here. Any questions as I'm finding my lecture?
Voloshik had a couple of questions.
Please.
So the first one is, are there any molecular factors that predict the stochastic effect?
No. Stochastic, it really means random, and you can't predict where the radiation is going to damage. Like lots of people would like to be able to predict, like so there are some people that claim that, okay, if the chromatin is in a more open conformation, it's more likely to be to get hit by radiation. But the fact is, if the radiation doesn't come near the nucleus, it's not going to be hit. So stochastic really means random, and it makes